This is Tommy's Outdoors 73, and today our guest is Kilian Murphy, and I talk with Kilian about using artificial intelligence, machine learning, to model the ecosystems and model rewilding. So essentially, to use computer model to see how the rewilding will look like and how the animals will behave before we put them onto the landscape. And if you follow me on social media, especially on Twitter, at Outdoors Podcast, give me a follow if you haven't already. This is something I talk about a lot recently. So this podcast is very timely. It was recorded over Zoom, so if you're listening to audio-only version of this podcast, you may hear like awkward pauses from time to time because of the varying internet speeds and so on. But you can always head on to YouTube and watch that podcast and watch us talking as well on YouTube. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, Kilian Murphy and Quantitative Ecology. Hey, Kilian, welcome to the show. Glad to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
Right. Look, I look at your Twitter profile, and I was like, whoa! Like, you're actually studying deer management, and you're into martial arts, and you're working with artificial intelligence. So it's like, well, I can see there's a lot of common ground here, because like for my day job, I'm working with artificial intelligence as well, and I have a past in martial arts, and obviously we're here to talk about outdoor stuff like deer management and so on. So maybe the best thing, if you can introduce yourself to our listeners, what you do, and how it happened that you do what you do. Was it something that you always wanted to do?
No, I kind of fell into it on a series of unfortunate events. Well, not really unfortunate, but it kind of was a long road to get there. My granddad is a forester down in West Cork, and he used to take us out to a place called Glengarriff. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And we used to have these nature tables in primary school, and all the kids would be bringing in like an oak tree leaf, and we'd be bringing in a full set of antlers. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of got the nature connection early. I wanted to be working with wildlife, I wanted to be working outdoors. And my dad is in computer programming, and he said, you'll never make any money if you don't work in computer programming. So that was kind of drilled into us as kids. So
that
my mom said,
unexpected for the forester.
I know, yeah. No, my granddad's the forester, my dad's the computer programmer.
Oh, okay, the granddad. Okay, gotcha.
Both ends of the spectrum.
Right.
And my mom said, do whatever you want, but be the best at it, and then you'll never have to worry about money. Which is good advice.
This is good advice.
So then was going through leaving cert and doing work experience, and I decided I'll do veterinary because that seemed to be a good way to work with animals and stay connected to the outdoors. And I did a week's work experience down in, I won't name the veterinary clinic, but a veterinary clinic in Meath. Mm-hmm. And I was given charge of 2 German shepherds who had been brought in, who were abandoned. And after 4 days, I came in, everyone's going great. I was taking them for little walks every day and things were going great. On the 4th day I walked in, they'd bled out overnight.
Jesus.
And I walked in and they handed me, the guy who was removing the dog, handed me a plastic bag with the frozen dog in it. And that kind of shook me. I was like, oh, Jesus. So I walked around the back, and as I was walking around the back, a dog had been hit by a car outside and its brain was hanging out, and they were bringing him in. So I walked out and I walked home, and I was like, right, veterinary's not for me either. So
what happened to those dogs? Why they bled out?
Oh, they were just horribly malnutrition. They were malnourished and dehydrated, and they were hanging on my bed all week. But I was kind of like naively saving them in my head by taking them for little walks every day and giving them water.
Gotcha.
Then I went 360 and I decided I was going to do like writing or law. And then I did law work experience and I was bored of it. So I decided to put down science because I thought it was like a nice, like basic background. In Trinity and UCD, you go in early and you can try everything and then you kind of refine as you go along. But I knew I wanted to do like zoology, environmental side of it. Mm-hmm. And so I went in, kind of got through the first few years because I didn't do any science subjects in school, just geography and ag science. Mm-hmm. And I got to my final year, and in second year I read this book by Sean Ellis called The Man Who Lives with Wolves. Mm-hmm. And looking back with a scientific mind, it's pretty shocking, but back then I was pretty green, and it was fascinating. Like, he basically goes off into where is he? It's Montana or something like that, Idaho. He goes off into the Idaho wilderness, and he's a wolf trainer, wolf handler, and he decides to do this little experiment, and he goes off into the Idaho wilderness and integrates with a wolf pack. And everything you learn about predators when you're younger is that they're dangerous and they'll eat you. And if you talk to an adult in Dublin City at the moment and you say, oh, if you bring back wolves to Ireland, which I'm sure we might talk about in this episode, they'll say, oh, sure, wolves will be dangerous and they eat the children and they break into our homes at night. Like, so I was getting this brand new perspective on predators and ecology, and I was like, this is fascinating. Then my whole perspective changed, and I decided I was going to go track wolves in the Idaho wilderness, and that was my new obsession. So I had a project plan on reintroducing wolves to Ireland for my final year thesis. I slapped it on the desk, and there was a professor in Trinity called John Rochford, and he used to entertain my ideas by bouncing back and forth forever. And I slapped this project proposal down. I was like, I'm going to Idaho. I'm going to go live in the wilderness and watch wolves and figure out how we're going to bring them back to Ireland. And I'd say the Trinity research committee looked at that and laughed. And anyway, they assigned me to Andrew Jackson, who's a quantitative ecologist in Trinity. And he said he loved the energy, he loved the idea of the project, and he goes, but you're not going to Idaho to track wolves because that's ridiculous. So he introduced me to a method called agent-based modeling, where you essentially build the environment into a computer and then you can run experiments on it. And that really opened my eyes to what's possible when you integrate ecology and computational ecology. So after the long road, I ended up computer programming and coding, but doing it for ecology. So it all kind of blends together in the end.
That's fascinating. Listen, so I'm infinitely interested in what you said about the building computer models that reflect the environment. How do you go about, how do you even start doing that, and then how accurate are those models, or are there any way of validating the accuracy, or whether these models are really modeling what they're supposed to?
Yeah, so it's a method called agent-based modeling, and it's been around since the 90s, but it's continually developing and getting better. And to break it down to its nuts and bolts, it's essentially 3 computational components. So you've got agents, which would be me and you. You'd have groups, which would be like a group of people or a group of birds, and then you have the environment. And you can program these agents exactly how you like. So they can be completely arbitrary. They could be animal A, and if you're testing the predator-prey dynamic, you can put 5 animal A and 1 predator B, and see how different populations affect the predator-prey dynamic. Or you can say predator B is a wolf and predator A are deer, and you can code in different aspects of their ecology and see how the relationship plays out over time and space. That's what makes them so useful, because they're spatially explicit.
Right.
But in terms of calibration and model testing, I think they work best when you combine them with data from the field. So you go through, you do a literature search. Like I was coding an agent-based model a couple of weeks ago, and I had to find out how many grams of protein were in 1 ounce of mule deer milk. So you have to go pretty deep into the literature to find these kind of weird stats. Or else you can combine it with a field experiment. So if you're running an experiment in Phoenix Park on deer movement ecology, and you know that they move this amount per day because you've done a 3-year study, then you can code that in, and that's a far better way to calibrate your model. Yeah. But then there's other more advanced stats techniques like sensitivity analysis and approximate Bayesian computing that you can use to kind of guess the parameters and then refine them using machine learning and stuff like that.
Yeah. So these will be like a features in the model that you're finding. For example, if you want to model how the deer behaves, you need to figure out what are the parameters, because there's obviously environment and where they can go, and then when where like Phoenix Park, there's a city nearby, that obviously affects the deer. And so how do you figuring out how many of those parameters, because surely you need to decide that, okay, these particular features or parameters, they're not relevant for my model, right?
Yeah, you'll kind of figure that out as you're building the model and as you're testing it. So initially I write down what I'd like the model to look like on a piece of paper, and then I build that into the environment, and then you can either add or shed different parameters that aren't useful.
Oh.
But what I'm doing now at the moment with the model that I'm building is, so my undergrad thesis was a very basic, because it was completely theoretical. It was all if-then computer statements. So if wolf is hungry, then wolf hunts. So it's kind of sequential. And although you can get some cool information and there is a bit of randomness involved, you kind of know the results of the model after you build it, and you're kind of hoping that you get those results. So it's not very scientific. But what I'm doing at the moment is I'm building, so each agent has an internal model. So when you walk outside your house, you view your environment and you take that data in and you decide what you're going to do based on what you can see. So in my original my wolf model, wolf was hungry, so wolf had to go find food. That was basically it. Whereas now I'm building machine learning models, such as like Q-learning algorithms and more basic machine learning models inside the agents, so that they can take data in, make choices, save the outcome of that choice as a success or a failure. And then the next time they get that same data, they know which worked better. And then they can make choices based on
kind of like reinforcement learning.
Yeah. So it's a lot more accurate. And I think it's kind of the future of agent-based modeling.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to be careful to not go deep into machine learning and stuff, because that's
I know.
for and people were listening that say, what the hell they're talking about. So this is quantitative ecology, right? So I don't want to put the words in your mouth. So maybe explain quantitative ecology. So this is essentially, I'm not going to say anything. I leave it up to you.
Yeah. Quantitative ecology is basically using lots of data, statistical models and computational methods to answer your questions in ecology. So rather than going out into the field and collecting data and like being
tracking wolves in Idaho. Exactly,
yeah. You're using data. Now you can pair up with field ecologists, which is often the case. But we're more interested in the modeling and the data analysis and all that kind of side of it, kind of back end of science.
Yeah, and listen, how maybe established is the wrong word, but over time, do you have any information, any data, how much those predictions and those models are really predicted or worked out compared to what happened in reality? So what's the accuracy of modeling?
Well, I'm sure you know yourself, working in AI, you kind of split your data 70-30 into training and testing. So you train your data until you get all the right things what you're looking for from the model. So like your distribution and all that, like you're looking at your model results. And then you test it on your testing data to see how it applies to data it hasn't seen before. So they're pretty accurate, and we don't tend to put anything out into the world that we're not 100% confident in. Because it has our name on it.
Yeah, but what I meant is, like, were there any examples of, let's say, I'm making that up now, the quantitative ecology in the models, for example, say like, well, we're going to reintroduce a big predator into this area, and they all going to be fine and going to regulate, ecosystem, and it will be great, and all the sheep and dogs are safe. And then the predators are introduced, and it turns out that the first thing they do, they hammer all the sheep and dogs and not touching any deer who run past. For example, right? I'm making that example out, but are there any like a real world cases where those types of models worked and there are positive outcomes, or maybe some, because I'm sure there's a lot of criticisms around this methodology, especially from people who are not that deep into technology, saying like, oh, you never can model natural environment, it's too complex, and it's too this and too that, and it's never going to work.
Well, I think you saw that with the COVID modeling, which I thought was really interesting. There was a thing called I can't remember, I think it's the profits problem or something like that, whereby the models are incredibly accurate and the techniques are pretty robust, and like we know how to do them. We're trained pretty well as scientists how to do these models. But with COVID, the forecasts were pretty spot on, and then everyone started tearing the models to shreds because we locked down as a result of that forecast, and that changed the model predictions, because obviously if our behavior is different, then the parameters are different and the outcome is different. So everyone locked down, the cases flattened out as they were expected to, and everyone was like, oh, well, we didn't see that exponential curve that everyone was talking about.
Yeah.
So that's one example of how models are pretty accurate. And then we know with species reintroduction is a huge problem, and it's a big challenge in terms of modeling, because if like what we're doing at the moment in UCD with the Smart Deer project is we're taking historical data from Ireland, we're taking current stakeholder knowledge, we're building models off that, we're going to make our predictions, and then we can actually test those in real time, because deer have been there, people know where the deer are, and then the models will tell us where the deer are, so we can actually test that. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you were talking about introducing a wolf to Ireland, you can take data from Italy or Germany or France. You can you can use species distribution modeling to figure out what kind of environmental parameters they like, such as south-facing slopes or this type of soil or this type of woodland. But it's completely arbitrary, because when you put that into Ireland, you've no idea. Wolves are so adaptive. Most predators are. You've no idea how they're going to react on the ground in Ireland.
That's what I'm saying.
You could model in Scotland or in France. We have X amount of deer density. We have X amount of distance to farms. We have X woodland density, and we have X amount of mountainous terrain. How are wolves going to do? And then you apply that to Ireland, and you adjust the parameters for Ireland. But wolves could take off and be in the Phoenix Park. Like wolves are so adaptive. You don't know when and where they're going to go, and modeling them is quite difficult unless you have very accurate data and data input.
Yeah. And so what you're saying is essentially the data that you can get from other areas might not reflect the situation in a particular ecosystem that you're trying to model, in this case, Ireland. Yeah,
well, you can reflect the ecosystem quite well, but in terms of paws on the ground, it's very difficult to model where they're going to go.
Yeah. Okay. Listen. So we wade in already into wolf reintroduction into Ireland. So let's talk about that. Has been any modeling done on that?
So as far as I know, the only two projects done on that, and I'll say now, as a signatory to the Berne Convention and the Habitats Directive, there's two stipulations in those EU directives that say where species have been eradicated due to human cause, nations are obliged to research and study potential reintroduction of those species. So Ireland is legally, under the EU, bound to do this research on lynx, boar, bear, wolf, everything. Yeah. But we just don't. So as far as I know, and I could be wrong here, so I'm going to preface that quite strongly. Mm-hmm. The only research I know that's been done on wolf reintroduction to Ireland is my undergrad thesis project, which was talking about wolf management and conflict resolution and how that applies to wolf reintroduction. Mm-hmm. And then a project by Louis O'Neill in 2004, and I actually have his thesis in my room, so I used it for my own thesis. And he did a full biological viability study on the wolf reintroduction to Ireland.
Right, and so can you share findings from this work? How this would work, and what guys you put out?
I've kind of flogged this topic to death, and I've bounced around it for the last 5 years maybe. I used to think wolf reintroduction to Ireland was absolutely essential. It needed to be done, and it needed to be done today. Just ship them in, get them on, and they'll be fine.
Cut them loose.
I know, yeah. But the more you learn, and I think most importantly, the more you expose yourself to Ireland's ecology and culture and socio-political landscape, the more you kind of realize wolf reintroduction will be a capstone on top of a lot of ecological regeneration.
Yeah.
So one thing that I discussed with John Rochford a lot was we have all these mountainous regions in Ireland, and if you drive by them, they're bare. There's some heather, there's some like grasses and some sedges, but it's essentially bare. If you go down the M7 motorway towards the south, the M7 M8 motorway, and you look left and right, we've loads of forest, but it's all coniferous plantations. And if you've walked through those, it's like walking through a graveyard. It's these silent, bare forest floor. It's horrible. I worked as an ecologist for Tobin Consulting Engineers for about 1.5 years. Mm-hmm. after I finished college and before I connected with Simone in UCD.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a real eye opener. So they're building a pipeline from Shannon to Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty big project. I'm not sure if you've heard of it.
Mm-hmm.
And our job was to walk that pipeline, to
Mm-hmm.
walk the route that they proposed to do. And just walking through what Ireland's pristine nature was a real eye opener for me.
Yeah.
I saw our connection with nature is so disrupted and so false.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's anyone's fault. A lot of people are quick to blame the farmers, but I don't think it's the farmers' fault at all.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of farmers are pretty headstrong about not caring about nature. But we met so many farmers along that route, and a lot of people are party to nature and they enjoy it and they enjoy seeing the wildlife in their area.
Mm-hmm.
But they're just not compensated in a way to do high nature value farming.
Yeah.
So one proposition, and I know it's pretty controversial, is to eradicate sheep farming.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of people have these sheep up on the hills. They get paid through a scheme to keep sheep on the hills.
Mm-hmm.
Sheep overgrazed, they're up there all year. And then the sheep farming isn't even productive in terms of economic value. If they didn't have the compensation, they wouldn't be earning the money.
I know one sheep farmer. He's hill farming sheep, and he said to me, like, if you want to make $1 million on sheep farming, you need to have 10 million first.
Yeah. I know it's a very controversial thing to say, but if you swapped out using CAP,
mm-hmm.
Common Agricultural Policy, if you swapped out the subsidies for holding sheep and instead had subsidies for forest regeneration and like pond building and all these kind of ecological restoration projects, then you could begin to talk about having a beaver back in. And then eventually, once you've got this huge scape of wilderness, you could talk about having lynx and you can see how they fare.
Mm-hmm.
And then over a 20-year period where you kind of make all these small changes to the environment and then you start changing public perception, people start going for walks in these massive deciduous woodlands and they see little bits of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Then you could talk about having potentially wolves back into an environment. Yeah. Because we have the landscape. Wolves don't need, it's a pretty common misconception that wolves need the entire island of Ireland just to roam. Wolves can persist in an area of 20 kilometers squared, which is pretty small, yeah, as long as they have enough prey. But at the moment, we have golden eagles up in Donegal that don't have enough prey because our landscape is just so morphed from what it was.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of factors to consider, and I know wolves are kind of like the sexy subject to debate. Yeah. But for me, I'd like to work.
Needs to happen before they can be reintroduced. So essentially,
it'd be like going back to the Middle Ages and handing someone an iPhone, and they'd be like, "Oh, this is class." There's no network. The iPhone's completely unsupported. It'd be kind of useless back then. So.
Yeah, gotcha. And listen, just a quick one. Your mentioned number of species. What's your view on wild boar, reintroduction of wild boar? And if it's like a long-winded. Okay, let's. No, I'm just because I want to continue on the subject what you said, but just like a little segue about the wild boar because you mentioned beaver and lynx and wolves, but you didn't mention wild boar. Is it anything?
We already have wild boar running around the place. That's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're wild boar are pretty destructive when they're not looked after in terms of predators. Like if you look at Canada has huge problems now with wild pigs. And I worked in an animal sanctuary after my leaving cert, and we had wild boar there, and they're fairly intimidating creatures when you meet them. But no one has really noticed them unless they're in direct contact with them. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a good indicator, but I know that it's people releasing them so they can shoot them is the reason. But then wild boar breed at a rate of knots, so they
they're quite aggressive when in terms of expansive. I guess that's probably the better
expansive,
word. Yeah. In terms of litter, and they can the sows can litter like 2 times a year, and this. So yeah. Are you saying that we essentially will have a wild boar across the island anyway because they're already out, and once they're out, there's once the genie out of the bottle, there's no coming back?
I'm not sure how prolific they are in Ireland at the moment, but as far as my understanding is that they're already in certain woodlands, and they're kind of persisting long term. So I would imagine if we kind of expanded habitats, and I know, sure, Quilcher have just announced the Dublin Mountain Plan. Mm-hmm. So if we have that kind of natural regeneration over time, I think wild boar will kind of naturally persist and move into these areas.
Okay. Because initially I was under the impression that you're going to say that like once we rebuild the ecosystems, once we rebuild the nature and landscape really, and reintroduce wolf, now once we have wolf, then we can put the boar in because then they can be controlled by wolf. So that was what I thought you're going to say, but it's like, no, wild boar is already there.
But see, you've got this paradox, and it's globally, but it's especially bad in Ireland, I think, because the divide between Dublin, especially as an area, and the rest of the country is so broad. So if you go into Trinity College and you go, what do you think about wolf reintroduction? They're like, oh my God, we have to do it. We're honor bound to do it. And if you'd asked me, it would have been me as well. And then you go down to a farmer and you listen, and their points are so valid. Like they know what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. So we need to bridge that divide. We need to invest in education. We need to invest in restoration. And then you can't just rush to the finish line. You have to take each step in the journey seriously. You have to invest in it if that's what we want. And I know there's a lot of talk about it at the moment, but Ireland's a great place for talking and not a great place for practical conservation.
Listen, yes, you're right. And do you think this is maybe how serious that issue is that you just mentioned? That because on one hand, I'm looking about the fence. Like on one hand, I understand. I'm kind of on that group. Like people in cities, right, in Dublin and who never really seen the wildlife. They have a strong opinions, right? They have a strong opinions about hunting. Yeah. They have a strong opinions about reintroduction of species and so on, right? Having very little knowledge and contact with them. Then you have farmers who also have somehow limited view, and this is understandable because they're living in there, right? And I always say that you can if you're living in a and you see I really don't like to dig that divide between people in the city, people in the countryside. I don't want to do that because there are people like city mindset people who live in the countryside, and there are people who know good and well the reality of living in the countryside who are living in a city because that's where they work and so on. So I don't want to come from the perspective that I'm digging a divide, but there's my thinking is like a cat lady in Dublin who screams about the reintroduction of wolves. Once that wolf will tear apart her cat, her view would change, right? And this is it. Like, it's easy for someone to say, like, those farmers, one sheep gets killed and they're crying. Like, yeah, but it's not your sheep. It's not your, and I'm always saying, like, well, imagine you working on the presentation for your boss, right, on your PowerPoint the whole week. You're doing something. You're trying to make it work, and there's a big day, big presentation to your investors and so on, and you come in and it's all deleted, and your computer is shredded apart, right? Would you be pissed off? Yeah, that's equivalent what happens to a farmer who is rearing a sheep or cattle, and all of a sudden gone, right? Oh, because wolf needs to live too, and this is why that whole history came in, and then you mentioned about education, and what I notice is that the moment you mention education, both parties are kind of offended, like, oh, they want to educate us and they have no idea about how do you see how it is possible, how even to start to kind of trying to find a common ground and a common language and trying to both groups to understand where the other one is coming from?
I don't know, to be honest. It's because it's such different worlds, and it is. Someone who spends 9 to 5 in an office it'll be very difficult to understand a farmer's life, because a farmer's life is a tough life. They're up at 5 in the morning to milk cows, and they're out there till 6 or 7 in the evening. I was saying it's super tough. Yeah. Sorry, I thought my internet connection dropped.
Yeah.
So I think RTE are running a show at the moment that my mom absolutely loves called Kids in the Village. And they take kids from the inner city and put them on a farm. And that kind of thing is hilarious, but it's not realistic in terms of the wide public. So I think the best way in terms of education is to open up our landscape again, to regenerate, like what Quilcher are doing in terms of forest regeneration. I went for a walk in Wicklow Mountain National Park over Christmas. And we were coming up a hill, and the place was bare. It had been, all the trees had been chopped down. There was tire tracks all over the place. Like, that's our national park. So if that's your one experience with nature a week, and it's chopped down trees and tire marks, you're not going to have a deep appreciation for it. Whereas if you're walking through an ancient oak woodland and you see a red squirrel run in front of you, and you see a buzzard flying overhead, and you see a badger set, then you kind of start to connect with it a bit more, and you start to get excited about it. And then you'll have just a bit more cop on in terms of what nature is. And then I think early teaching in schools is another thing you can do. I did ag science. I think that was one of the best subjects in the Leaving Cert personally. So yeah, I'm not sure how to do it, to be honest. It'd be a tricky thing to do. And obviously not everyone is as interested or on board. So that's another problem.
Yeah, but you're saying that Ireland is really obliged under EU to do the research, but its only obligation is to do the research. It's not like try to restore anything or introduce, right?
Well, I think you need to figure out the root cause, and in terms of us, it was Oliver Cromwell, which I wrote extensively about my thesis.
It's not the first time on this podcast when that statement.
And my thesis supervisor said, get less patriotic and more scientific. So I had to scale it back, and I had to kind of balance the view out. But yeah, it was Cromwell, the bastard.
Yeah.
Who, because the native Irish we were pretty in tune with nature and ecology. Now, we weren't going out there and hugging wolves, but we built ring forts, and we hunted wolves, and we made sure they were in check. But there was never like a broad scale idea to eradicate them. And then Cromwell came in, and in 1653 he issued a decree. Well, the decree was, I'm not sure if that's the right date, don't quote me on that, but he issued a decree that said Ireland will never be a civilized land until we get rid of the woods and the wolves. So in order for us to be civilized, we chopped down all our trees and we killed all the wolves. And that event, I believe anyway, really was a turning point in Ireland's landscape ecology and our socio-culture towards ecology, how we view ecology. Because all of a sudden, these iconic animals became pests, and everything that supported that ecosystem became pests, and it was all about development. And we won't talk about the afters and what happened after that. But.
Yeah. Okay, but so in your view, is I'm careful but there's no way around to not use the word rewilding. And I know good and well this is like controversial term, but maybe restoration of nature is that something that gonna happen in the next 10 years, let's say, in Ireland? How do you think? What do you think? Is it going in the direction? Is it moving in a direction that we have any chance of actually talking about wolves and lynx in the next 10 years, or do you think is no way?
Well, I think so. The project I'm working on at the moment with Simone Ciuti in UCD, we're in 2020 now. Let's check the watch for the year. And we're in 2020, and we're currently working on the first project to set a scientific baseline for deer management in Ireland. So we've had deer since the Middle Ages, and we are only now working to figure out where they are, how many there are, what kind of landscape they like. And I think every kind of time I delve into a new project, it opened my eyes a little bit more in terms of ecology in Ireland. And this project, because we're speaking to everybody, we're speaking to so many stakeholders, it is eye-opening, because I connected with Simone after I finished my undergrad degree. We had a field trip down in Glendalough, and I was chatting to one of the PhDs in Trinity, And he was basically detailing the life of a PhD. And I was like, oh, well, that's what I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I emailed every university lecturer in Britain and Ireland. And Simone got back to me and said, I'm swamped at the moment, which is pretty on brand for him. And he said, contact me in July. So I met him in July and we were chatting back and forth. And he did a postdoc in in Alberta, Canada.
Mm-hmm.
But they were working with the government in North Dakota
mm-hmm.
on mule deer and energy development, so oil and gas plantations.
Yep.
And he had a project that he didn't have time to finish on mule deer, coyote, and oil and gas, and how they all affect each other.
Mm-hmm.
And he was like, look, you can finish this project while you're working in Tobin, so you can kind of keep your scientific skills up, and then we can talk about getting into UCD. So working on that project, we had a data set from 1962 to 2012, 50 years of systematic data collection, where the mule deer were, where the coyotes were, where the oil and gas were, the weather, like the amount of, like, it was just a ridiculous data set. And then we come to the project I'm doing now, which is pretty similar in that we're trying to estimate species abundance in Ireland and density, and then realize the causal factors that drive them to certain landscapes and all these kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the difference between North America and Ireland in terms of how they view their wildlife, it's opposite ends of the spectrum. So Ireland needs to really have an attitude shift in how we invest in our wildlife. And like, we can talk about lynx and wolves and bears, but if we don't manage and invest in the wildlife we have right now, and we perfect that model, then there's no point throwing more variables into the mix that will only complicate things and piss people off.
Huh. Huh. I think you hit the nail on the head here, that we need to kind of stabilize the system that we already have with the variables that we already have before we start throwing more stuff in. And I think this is like a good pivot into deer, and again, the issue that I was talking about on this podcast with various people many times, that we don't know what's the deal with deer in Ireland, how many we have, and so on. And that was to me quite puzzling, really. By the way, do you hunt? Are you a hunter?
No, but I'd like to get into it eventually.
Oh, right.
It's definitely something I'd like to do.
All right, we can talk about that as well. That as well. So, the one thing that I always say, that when you go on a training course for hunters, which is now mandatory in Ireland, finally, first-time applicants are required to complete a course. The first thing they're gonna tell you on that course is you need to assess the population before you do a cull plan, and you know how many deer you can remove and whatever. You need to assess the population, and this is the month to assess the population, and so on and so forth. That's the first thing they're gonna tell you. And the next day they're gonna tell you is like, oh, because hunters are not calling enough females. You need to call females. Everybody wants antlers, but you're not calling enough females. And then, okay, but how many deer is in Ireland? We don't know. Nobody knows, right? So it's like, oh, hang on a minute. Is it not just exactly against everything that you just said, right? You said that you need to assess the population. Then you're making statements as if you already know, and then it turns out that you don't know really. There's no deer census nor anything like that. So please tell us about that work that you do, and when can we actually have some results and know what's the deal with deer? Or maybe you can share some preliminary results already with us.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I remember after I finished my wolf project in final year, I went to Andrew and I said, I want to continue this research. I want to keep working with wolves. Mm-hmm. And he goes, look, I know you love the wolves, but take a step back and look at like everything. He's like, there's only wolves in a certain amount of countries, and everyone wants to work on the big predators. He's like, don't work on wolves, work on deer, because deer are absolutely everywhere and people know very little about them. Mm-hmm. And Simone's speciality, Dr. Simone Sayudi in UCD, that's his speciality. He's worked on deer in Canada, North America, France, Germany. He's got such a plethora of knowledge on deer. And we've kind of built this lab based on wildlife behavior and ecology, but a big aspect of it is deer. So we've got all these young people who are interested in deer with Simone on top. And it's just a great ecosystem for knowledge. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing at the moment, which I think is really important, because you can talk about wolves and deer and bears, but the bottom of the pyramid is the landscape in terms of environmental variables. But the next one up is prey and the deer population. So there's absolutely no realistic conversation about wolves at the moment, because we have no idea what's going on with our deer. And people are so happy to just jump over that fact. Being like, I'll figure out the deer. Or the wolves will control the deer. But we might need control. We might have a declining population, or we might have a steadily increase. We have no idea at the moment. Mm-hmm. So our project, which is funded by the Department of Agriculture, is called Smart Deer. We are setting a scientific baseline for deer management in Ireland. We're not going to do the managing. We have no political alignment. We have no aspiration to do that. We want to give people the tools to make smart management choices. That's what our plan is. Mm-hmm. So we kind of break our plan down to 3 different stages. We are, first of all, getting in touch with everyone in Ireland, because a big problem with Ireland is we have no national deer monitoring scheme. Yeah. And there's been several attempts to do that in the past, but it hasn't been successful. So Quilcha collect deer data. National Parks and Wildlife collect deer data. Tommy, who owns a forest in Wicklow, collects deer data. But you can also, Tommy manages plot A in Wicklow and Kilian manages plot B. We can manage deer completely differently. Tommy might love deer and he loves seeing them on his land, and Kilian might shoot every single one he sees. Mm-hmm. There's no consensus on how we manage or view our deer.
Exactly.
So none of us have 40 years of experience in deer management in Ireland. So our first plan was to reach out to everybody who is involved in deer management, talk to them, understand their views, and see if they have data that they'd like to contribute to the project. Mm-hmm. So our plan was to hold this national workshop in March, but that kind of got screwed by the COVID thing. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't the worst thing, because it kind of made us go, our plan was to pitch the project to a big group of people and then show them what we can do. But rather than that happening, we actually had to go and talk to people individually, and they showed us what they can do, which kind of updated our education a lot. So we're still very much in phase 1 of talking to people and getting their data. And then we're also developing a smartphone application for foresters and hunters and outdoors people, so that they can conduct deer surveys when they're out and about.
Yeah.
And the important thing is there's apps like iNaturalist and other things like that, where if you see 5 deer, you just put in 5 deer. Whereas we are introducing a density metric as well. So you have to say, I walked this route in 2 hours. Mm-hmm. So you see X amount of deer in X amount of time. So you can get an estimate of density as well. Uh-huh. So that's phase 1. Phase 2, the project kind of splits in half. We're creating a data library. So we're taking all that data from everybody who's agreed to join the project. Mm-hmm. We're creating a universal data library on all the deer collected in Ireland, and adding in the smartphone app deer data. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to model the data. So that'll tell us where and why deer are in Ireland. And then the third phase is dissemination education. So we're going to tell everyone our results. We're very about open science. We want to, there's no point conducting all this research and then keeping it locked behind peer review. Yeah. So we're going to tell everyone widely, and we're going to give everyone the tools to make informed management decisions on deer in Ireland. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you guys engaged with any hunters organizations in Ireland as well?
Yeah. We've been involved with FACE and Liam Nolan, and we've pretty much reached out to a lot of hunting communities. We've got in touch with the big organizations, and we've got in touch with smaller commercial companies. Mm-hmm. We've updated, we have a fairly good idea on how hunting in Ireland works now. Mm-hmm. We've also got a pretty good idea on the poaching situation, which is a massive issue. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we're constantly learning.
What are the outcomes, like how the hunting works, and is there anything interesting there?
I'm not going to speak for the project. I'll speak for myself on how I think hunting works. I think hunting in Ireland could be done a lot better, personally. Mm-hmm. Again, I look at the North American system with their tags. Really, like if you pull over a hunter in Ireland on the N11 motorway and he's got a deer in the back, he could say, oh, my buddy shot the deer and I'm just bringing him home for him. And you haven't a clue who shot the deer, if it was poached, if it was shot legally, if it was shot on illegal land or whatever. In America, you have tags. You have a deer, you have a tag, they come together, and that's how you keep track of everything. In Ireland, it seems a bit more loose, and people take advantage of that loose system, I think.
Mm-hmm.
It's also, I don't think that strongly enforced, so I think people take advantage of that too.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we have no idea on actual population densities and distribution. So our hunting system is essentially shooting in the dark because we don't exactly know the situation in Ireland.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, to be honest, I agree with you. And again, that's not the first time on this podcast where North American system is being mentioned as a sort of a gold standard of, you know, how to do conservation and how to do wildlife management. And I totally agree with you that, you know, as much as I appreciate the opportunity for, you know, to go hunt deer, like you mentioned, there's a very little control, and I love the fact that I'm not advocating too much of the red tape to go into hunting, but at the same time, where you know you go into a gun shop and you hear two guys bragging, oh, I shot 200 deer last year, right? And it makes you think, it's like, okay, you either bullshitting or you really shot 200 deer. Like, how is this legal? Like, like, what's the impact? Was it like a young deer, old deer? What's going on? And you're right. It is legal in fact, because you have no bag limits, you have no quota, you have no restriction on age class. It's just male, female, open season, and off you go. So I'm taking from you that you'll be in favor of having like a tag system and stuff like that.
When you talk about hunting, the hunting community is really the third leg of the monster. There's the urban community, the farmers, and the hunting community kind of sits in the middle and it bridges the gap.
I love that you just said that. I can't wait what you're gonna say next. Please.
So I think hunters have their own unique attitude and outlook towards wildlife. And I think education there is as needed as anywhere else. And I know you were saying that people get offended. I think the hunters would be very offended if I said that. Mm-hmm. But there's been research done in New York on hunter attitudes and education and the benefit of education on hunter attitudes. Because a lot of people will say, don't shoot females because you don't get a trophy and because it sustains the population. But if a population is out of control, then shooting females is a really important thing to do. And just going back to that North American model, we're talking about investing in rewilding and conservation. I think it's 20%, you might correct me on this, 20% of each outdoor gear bought in America goes into conservation and funding.
Big Robertson Act.
Yeah. So it funds wild landscapes, it funds diverse ecosystems and populations of wildlife. So that's a model we could also adapt, because as more people decide to explore the outdoor community, Ireland loves taxing people. We get taxed for absolutely everything. So why not do a tax that gives back to the wildlife community?
Yeah. That's a couple of points on this. I think that you're right that hunters are kind of like in the middle, but majority of hunters are farmers as well.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's that thing. And again, another thing that I'm probably sound like a broken record here is that I feel like hunters are that link, like you said, in the middle that is, and to some extent there's a lot of opportunity, but on the other hand, they're kind of, the, let's say, animal loving crowd in the city hate hunters because they killing poor little furry babies, right? Yeah. And hunters kind of they're naturally leaning more towards farming sector because, one, like we said, the majority of hunters are farmers. Number two, they hunting on the land that belongs to farmers, right? So as a hunter, I like to be in a good standing with all the farmers, because ultimately I'm going to knock to one of the farmers' doors and say, hey, would you mind me to, hunt deer on your land, right? So, but I think, like you said, that the education may, and, when you say education, a lot of people think like, oh, now they're going to tell me, how the deer looks like, right? But maybe that's an education, just how to talk and how to bridge that gap. I feel like, I am infinitely upset when ecological organizations are refusing to recognize the role of hunters and leverage hunters and hunting community for conservation purposes.
Yeah.
And often only on the ethical ground, right? But these are the people who are really, and we all know about the discussion about trophy hunting and all that. I don't even want to get into that subject. But ultimately, hunters are people who want, rich, diverse ecosystem, who wants all those animals, who wants deer, who wants boar, who wants all these things being there. Mm-hmm. And I think that where the opportunity lies is like them being also a farmers. They actually could have the most knowledge, like on the ground knowledge about how things work and what would work, what wouldn't work for, on one end for farmers and on the other hand for conservation.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, well, going back to what you said earlier, and the animal lover in the city who hates hunters because they shoot deer while they tuck into their T-bone steak at night with. So exactly. It's a complete oxymoron. Like unless hunting makes sense, and it's an ethical way to get your food because that animal's out there living its life in the wild, and rather than die a slow death in a freezing Wicklow mountain, you're getting a clean kill.
Yeah. Exactly. That's the point. It's probably the best death that the animal could have, being shot by a hunter. Otherwise, it's not pretty.
But Ireland's got a pretty good, as far as I'm concerned, not so, as far as I know, and you will be more knowledgeable, so you can update me on this. We've got a pretty good governing bodies in Ireland with hunters. Like all hunters are pretty much it's a good community of people. Mm-hmm. And I think if even grad students, I know we'd love to do it. If you held voluntary lectures, so you don't force hunters to go, but you held lectures, short things like on ecology, on like our deer research, for example, I'm sure they'd be very interested to hear that. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure, like hunters, as you said, they want rich, diverse ecosystems. So if you force people to train, they probably won't want to. But if you held voluntary lectures bi-weekly or monthly, I'm sure that community would come, listen, maybe change their viewpoint, and we'd have a more instinct.
I know hunters who are actually traveling long distances to go to every single training course there is, and I'm one of those myself. If I hear about some training course, whether it's about the deer or shooting or woodlands, I'm there because that's just interesting, and people are interested in that. Listen, just to finish it off. You also researching, I guess, the deer in the disturbed landscapes, right? Yeah. Your handle is disturbed deer, like on Twitter. Like, tell us about that. What's that research about, and what you're doing? What are the results?
So that's kind of going back to the North Dakota work that I'm doing, because. Yeah, that's a very disturbed landscape.
Not in Ireland. It's more of a North Dakota and a mule deer.
Well, no, it's more because if you look at Ireland, Ireland's a disturbed environment. Ireland deer are not occupying the same landscape that they are known to occupy in Ireland since they came here. They either brought or like red deer and Kerry, where they naturally dispersed. Mm-hmm. But so I think I'm very interested, and not just in deer, just in wildlife in general. How wildlife adapt to human disturbance and how humans can improve their management of wildlife so that we all coexist together, and humans and wildlife can have the best experience of the landscape.
Yeah. That brings me back. That reminds me about the question I have with relation to wolves, because there's an interesting point that was raised many times, and you even raised that today, that wolves are adoptable, and they can adopt to a lot of situations. They don't need like thousands upon thousands of square miles of wilderness to live. I read an article, and I think that's actually you wrote that article about creating sort of restaurants for wolves. So essentially places where you feed wolves, so they're not predating on the livestock that much,
and that decreases the predation of the livestock. At the same time, still leaves the wolves, let's say, and quotes, hungry enough, so they essentially play their role in the ecosystem. And that's also a question I asked on the podcast. Is that the rewilding? Is that the wolves? And maybe, in general, wolves are just an example, but in general, that's an example. Do we want that, right? Because I understand, like, I'm talking a little bit from a selfish perspective, right? I want wilderness. I want wild wolves roam the wilderness and doing wolf things. When we start talking about wolves who are, sneaking around the streets and have their, restaurants here and there where we dump the carcass of the animal, and they're kind of like becoming urban wolves or semi-domesticated, I'm not sure if I'm that interested in this kind of wolves and this kind of rewilding.
Yeah. No, that was my undergraduate thesis research. So I was looking at national parks, and we used Cairngorms and Wicklow as just models, but it was kind of just landscapes in general. And it wasn't so much that people dump carcasses outside restaurants. The restaurant was kind of it was just a term we used. It was more in a national park, if you know where a wolf den is, you might put a dispensable cage, so like somewhere that a carcass can just appear overnight, basically, like in Jurassic Park with the goat. And then wolves know that there's because the biggest reason wolves disperse is lack of food. So they'll keep moving through the landscape until they find food. Yeah. So the idea for this was that they'd never be wanting for food, but that they would still hunt, because it would only be, it wouldn't be an everyday occurrence. It would be like a once a week kind of occurrence. That research was very abstract, very theoretical. We found interesting results, but I think the main point you made is you don't want those kind of wolves. Even if it was in a national park, you wouldn't want humans feeding wolves. But I think what you need to realize is there is no such, what is wild in 2020? Like, what is wild? So we've always managed predators, whether it be build fences or shoot them or stay away from them. We've always managed our relationship with predators since humans have interacted with predators.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look at, yes, we want wild animals. Yes, we want wild landscapes, but I don't think that's possible in 2020. It's only going to be these little islands that are heavily influenced by the sea of urban around them. So we need to look at, if we want these things from our landscapes, what is the best way we can manage them so that they can exist in harmony and that we can ensure that they exist in the long term?
Yeah, yeah.
Gotcha. So the idea of wolf restaurants was just,
it
was just one way of looking at conflict resolution.
Wilderness that is pristine, and the animals have a reign there. Is like, the reality is, like you said, that we have to manage whatever we decided to do.
Yeah. And I mean, if you look at, like, everyone likes to point to Canada or New Zealand or America for these pristine wildernesses. But the only reason you're getting photos of these pristine wildernesses is because there's a walking track right behind it, and there's people walking through it every single day. I've been to New Zealand, I've been to Canada, I've been in these pristine wildernesses, and yes, they are beautiful, but they're also heavily impacted by humans, one way or another. There's a car park 2 kilometers from that waterfall that everyone takes a photo of. So I don't think pristine wilderness exists in totality in 2020.
Yeah.
I think we need to manage the wilderness we have to ensure that humans can experience it. So I think it's integral to the human experience that we get out and we see nature and we feel small in the universe, because it's very easy to feel big when you're at your office desk typing a report. But when you're out, like myself and my friend, we were up in the Canterbury High Mountains, and we were walking through a woodland, and we knew there was these massive boar. And we were 24 years old, and we picked up these sticks, and we were walking around with these nervous energy because we knew that a boar could run out and hit us in the side in seconds. And I think if you don't feel insecure and you don't feel small, then you're going to live your life with this bullshit ego and that you're more important than you are. And like, again, getting kind of philosophical, in New Zealand, if you look up in the sky, you see this beautiful, because the human population is quite small there. You see this beautiful stars every single night, the Milky Way. And again, you just start questioning your whole role in this thing, and you feel small. And I think that's the best feeling in the world, personally.
Yeah, I agree. Totally. Listen, Kilian, we touched on many things. Is there anything that we haven't discussed but you wish we did?
We could have talked about martial arts. We're talking about ego and feeling small in the world.
Yeah. Is there any
Nothing makes you
message
feel
you would
smaller
like
than
to
getting
leave
choked.
our listeners with?
No, I think I had a great time. I really enjoyed it. It was a great chat. I'd love to do it again if you have me on.
The same here, Kilian. Let's stay in touch, and sure, we're gonna talk about get you into hunting, and we also gonna talk about machine learning and stuff like that. But that's gonna be off the record. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to chatting to you again.
No worries. Thanks for having me on. I had a great time. Cheers.